So welcome everyone. Scott and I are delighted to present with for all of you today. I want to just start by saying that we understand these are extraordinarily trying times, and we're grateful that you showed up for our webinar, and also know that you know with the COVID pandemic and now with the racism and violence in our country, we are a center that is dedicated to helping our nation's schools really work, through these difficult times and provide the resources and supports. So thank you for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my day job is the director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence, and I'm a professor at Yale in the Child Studies Center. And I spent the last 25 years of my career uh, pretty much running around the world trying to get people to understand the value and importance of emotions and teaching people the skills of emotional intelligence. And we're excited to launch with you this webinar on leading with emotional intelligence in uncertain times. Just briefly, as we jump into the webinar, our goal today really is to share with you the work that we've been doing for about 7 years now at Yale with district level leaders. What we have found over time is that when we start with the people who are running the district, whether it be superintendent, assistant superintendents, district level administrator, um, it makes all the difference in the systemic change that we all care about and want to have in our schools. Below, you can see our website, both for the center, where you can see more about the research, and then Ruler is our approach to social emotional that we're going to talk briefly about today. So we're going to cover 4 things, and Scott and I are going to share the stage. I'm going to teach you or talk through a little bit about why emotional intelligence, why now. Then we're going to discuss emotionally intelligent leadership, talk about our institute, and then the details of how you might register. So I think it's important to share real data about the mental health of our nation. Now, I wanted to say with a few caveats, or provide a few caveats. These are data that have been collected over the last couple of years, pre the most recent crises. And so what we know from research is that about 25% of our nation's youth have adjustment problems in school. It's up to 60% in our more disadvantaged areas. When it comes to adverse childhood experiences, also traumatic experiences, we know that about 45% of our nation's youth have at least one of the ACEs. 10% have 3 or more. Anxiety, which we have, by the way, more recent data show that over the last couple of months, these numbers may have increased by 6 to 8-fold. So, which is pretty serious. About 18% of our society is affected by an anxiety disorder, and the numbers are higher among adolescents, about 25%. And sadly, the suicide rates in our society have gone up 45% in the last 20 years. We also are very interested in bullying and bias in our center, and what we know is that on average, about 1/3 of our nation's youth are bullied in school. We also know that there is a racial bias in terms of the children who are suspended from school. And lastly, over the last couple of years, we've also seen an increase in anti-Semitism by the reports to the Anti-Defamation League, which have gone up about 100% per year. So that coupled with disengagement, which we find is around 20 to 40% in our nation's schools. Among employees, it's 50 to 60%. 13% of employees said they're miserable in a Gallup poll. And then in education, where we spend a lot of our time, what we have found is that nearly 50% of teachers pre these times are reporting excessive daily stress. About 85% of teachers say that work-life imbalance is affecting their ability to teach. And you may know this already, but about 30% of our teachers leave the profession after the first 5 years. So it's interesting to look at data, in context. So back in 2018, our center did a national study with about 6,000 teachers across the United States. And what we found back then was that the number one emotions were frustrated, overwhelmed, and stressed. Um, and I just want you to keep that in mind, that frustration appeared to be the number one emotion back in the day. We, in collaboration with CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning, where I'm a board member, ran a study at the end of March with about another 5,000 educators across the United States. And you can see the emotions that people were feeling at the end of March and April. It was pure anxiety. And my hunch is that if we launched another study, last week and this week, we would be seeing both anxiety and probably a lot of other strong emotions, anger, despair, some hopelessness. And so in our center, right, we have a motto, a saying where you have to, feel it to heal it, you have to name it to tame it. And in particular, what we're finding right now is that with all that's going on in society, anxiety seems to be very strong. And in our Scott and I just wrote a piece on educational leaders where we studied 1,000 leaders, and their data looks exactly the same. So to put a more positive spin on this presentation, the role of our center and the goal of our work is to use the power of emotions to create a healthier and more equitable, innovative, and compassionate society. And the workshop or the institute that we are leading over the summer is one that is rooted in a lot of science. And oftentimes, the challenge we have with implementing social and emotional learning in schools and districts is that people don't really know the science. And so during the summer training, what we will be doing is really diving deeply into the 3 decades of science that I've been participating in and others in terms of the role of emotions in attention, memory, and learning. Right? Think about it. Emotions are the drivers of our attentional capacity. Right now, right, all of us are having some strong emotions. It's hard for me to present today. It's hard for me to focus because of what's going on in society. And I'm sure many of you are having the same challenges. Decision making. We know that we like to think we're rational creatures, but what research shows pretty clearly is that how we feel influences the judgments and choices we make in life. Relationship quality, physical and mental health, performance and creativity. So briefly, in our Summer Institute, what we do is really go through the data and the science on the role of emotions in these 5 areas. I think also, one of the motivations for our work is to get people to move away from thinking that emotions are soft or that emotional intelligence is a soft skill. This is a project that I was involved with. It's the class of 2030 study by Microsoft and McKinsey. And as you can see here, 30 to 40% of our nation's jobs at minimum require these so-called soft skills. But what the research showed was that only 42% of employees believe new graduates are adequately prepared for the workforce, especially with social and emotional skills. So what that tells us is that when you think about the 21st century skills, when you think about what employers are looking for, I know this as a professor, a lot of the feedback I get is, yeah, your students can problem solve, but are they inspirational in team meetings? Do they know how to manage conflict? Do they know how to deal with the stress and the frustration and the overwhelm that's associated with creativity and success? And that leads us to the skills. So a big part of our Summer Institute for School Leaders, our district leaders, I should say, is on unpacking the skills of emotional intelligence. So there are 5 skills. We call them the ruler skills. And it's about recognizing our own and others' emotions and being aware of our biases in that process. It's about understanding, what are feelings and where are they coming from? Am I angry? Am I disappointed? And if I were to ask you right now, for example, are you disappointed, frustrated, angry, stressed, overwhelmed? Maybe you'd say all of the above, but there are differences between and among these emotions. And what we have found is that labeling is really important because it helps us to create meaning of our emotions and be able to communicate them. For those of you who are parents, when you have a 2-year-old who doesn't know how to share their feelings, you know the result of it. And then finally, the E and the R of ruler has to do with the management, what we do with these feeling states. So we'll go into a lot of detail, for example, on the different moderators around expressing emotion. What we know from research is that culture matters. Clearly, race and other ethnic variables influence whether or not people have the privilege to express their feelings in different contexts. Gender, personality, all these factors that influence whether or not we do express our feelings. And then finally, what are the strategies for regulating emotions? And I want to lastly say about this is that a lot of times people come to us and say, well, what's the right strategy? And the answer is that there is no correct strategy. And this is what makes, I think, emotional intelligence in many ways more interesting than other concepts, because there's no criterion of correctness here. It's about what works for you and your context. And so by definition, we ensure that the teaching of emotional intelligence is culturally responsive. Briefly, what we know from our research is that children who have less developed skills in this area look like the column on the left there. Adolescents and children who are more developed in emotional intelligence look like the column on the right. And these are studies with thousands of participants actually done cross-culturally. Our research with educators is very clear that teachers who have more developed emotional intelligence have these kinds of outcomes, from greater sensitivity and empathy to less stress and burnout to students who perform better academically. We also have done some interesting research that's just about to get published on the emotional intelligence of leaders and how that influences school climate, teacher stress and burnout. And so these are just, this is a sneak preview of the larger research studies that we'll be sharing over the Summer Institute. One thing that's interesting, I think, is that oftentimes people say, well, leaders who are, do a lot of talking about feeling, or, who, are emotionally intelligent are, they're just easier, and they're more lackadaisical. And what the research shows is actually that's not true. That people work as hard in organizations where there is someone who is lower and higher. But where the real difference shows up is in burnout rates. We found about a 25% difference in burnout among teachers in schools when there is a leader who is lower in emotional intelligence. So the burnout rates are 25% higher in our nation's schools, in our research, when a leader has less developed skills in this area. And going back to the research that we did a couple of years ago, we wondered, do teachers feel differently in these schools? And what we found, yes, it is true. When you look at that Wordle, that original one back from 2 years ago, that was the big study we did, and you break up the teachers who are in schools where there's a leader who's higher or lower in emotional intelligence, what you find is that there's a big difference in that culture and climate and in the emotions that teachers are feeling. So what I'm going to do is pause here and turn it over to Scott, who's going to take you through some of our work on leadership.
Thank you, Mark. So transitioning now to think about the role of leadership and connecting it to some of the concepts that Mark talked about and the ruler approach in general. We're going to start with the first slide, which has a quote. Give it a second to come up. The most effective way to change a system is by transforming the relationships among the people in the system. And when we think about the heart of much of our work, whether it's district office to board, or district office to building level, whether it's principal to teacher, teacher to student, student to student, or the school out to the parent community or guardian community, the relationships that are formed are really going to make or break the system and ultimately form the school climate. And so everything that we think about at our center oftentimes roots back to relationships. And so we'll talk more about that as we go through this section. So there are two components when we think about our institute, what we want to get across and what we hope that participants would get from it if they come join us. And the first is practical emotional intelligence skills that you can use in a leadership capacity as you go back to running a school district. And that's all about how to build relationships, conflict resolution, how to think about your own emotions and the interactions that you have with others, and how to use emotions wisely. The other piece, though, is if you think about an SEL approach for your district, how to think about it more systemically and how to think about it rather than piecemeal in a more holistic way. And so those are the two objectives that, that we have when we run the Summer Institute. And just to talk about the first one, we share some statistics on the superintendency. Many of you on the line right now are superintendents and or certainly in district office. And I think all district office jobs, you certainly, you'll relate to some of these challenges that we have on this slide, whether it's the intensity of the job and the amount of hours and work-life balance, whether it's the regulatory climate in which you find yourselves, whatever state you're in. If, certainly now more than ever, the budgetary and financial decisions that will have to be made and potentially cuts that will have to ensue, which obviously has ramifications for all of us. The rise in social media and how oftentimes when things happen in a district, with light speed, it'll be on social media, and sometimes it's on social media accurately, and sometimes it's on social media inaccurately, and that's yet another challenge that we all have to deal with as school leaders. And then relations between the district office and the superintendent and the board, and the relationship between board members for that matter, and just keeping that all healthy. These are major challenges, and these challenges were put together before we got to this point of the issues that we find ourselves in now, whether it be COVID, whether it be issues around racism and violence. And the implications that historically this has had on superintendency is really a shortening of the average duration of a superintendent being in a district. Some statistics in Massachusetts from about a year and a half ago, 20 to 25% per year turnover that they've seen in that state. I think that's very indicative of most states at this point. This is a quote from the New York State School Board Association newsletter. Also goes back about a year or a year and a half ago. Fewer people aspiring to be superintendents in the state of New York, and it being harder to fill superintendent slots. So these are real issues that we spend a lot of time thinking about our center. How can we make the job of the superintendent more manageable so that that longevity can exist for the good of the school district? And then more specifically, when we think about different components of district office challenges right now and how emotional intelligence skills relate to those challenges, we put not an exhaustive list, but some important ones down on the page. The first one being just general engagement and well-being. We're doing a lot of development of survey work right now on this topic. We certainly have a lot of strategies around self-care and managing stress and anxiety that we like to share with leaders. Talked about budget challenges a bit. When you think about the budget, that certainly relates to contract negotiations. It relates to making very difficult decisions. So how do emotions play into that? And how, again, do you use emotions wisely in order to maximize your ability to navigate through those challenges? The e-learning situation that we find ourselves in right now, probably more than ever. I think if you're working in district office, you probably, maybe not in every community, but in many communities, feel tension between parent expectations and then teacher expectations, and trying to bridge that gap and trying to make it all work is not an easy thing. And that involves communication skills and managing relationships, which roots back to our work as well. As we think about the prospect of reopening schools, whether it's partially or fully, whether that's in September or some point in the future, we don't quite know yet. It'll be different across the country potentially, but certainly it's going to take a lot of EI skills, everything from teamwork to communication to leading by example. We think a lot about governance and leadership as it relates to emotional intelligence as well. And then specifically, we've been certainly harnessing the resources that we have to try to do everything we can to give leaders tools to use as they have discussions or deal with issues around COVID-19 in their communities, as well as some of the issues around racism in society, as well as violence and just the tremendous polarization that we see in our country. And then lastly, school climate. We also spend a lot of time on school climate, and we certainly spend time in the Institute on that. And whether it's virtual or whether it's in our school buildings, SEL can certainly help support positive school climate and positive district climate all the way around. So going back to this notion of thinking about SEL systemically rather than piecemeal, which is what we strive to do, it's not an easy thing, and we recognize that. This is 2017 data. It was a national survey done by Castle. So it's not specific to ruler, but it's broadly across SEL. And what you see is that you do have 35% of reported principals saying that they're attempting to do systemic implementation. but only 17% of schools in this survey had a true long-term plan, and only 13% had any way to evaluate the work that they're doing, and only 14% of principals said that they had district support, which goes back to the heart of this institute and why we focus on district leaders, because there really is a lot you can do from the district level to think about this work very holistically and still give lots of creative opportunity to various school buildings and various principals to do great authentic work, but to have some framework that is common and that can be shared across the entire district. And when we think about the ruler approach, it really is all about moving from this concept, which oftentimes exists in SEL, of being piecemeal, whether it's a specific kit in a classroom or it's an assembly that you might have on a certain day, and rather to think about every aspect of the way in which a school works, from the school board down to community relations between teachers and parents or guardians, and of course the kids from the younger grades all the way up to 12th grade.
Scott, I just wanted to jump in here for 1 second. One of the things that we learned over the years, obviously most of us are in education because we care about kids. We want them to develop the skills they need to be the people they want to be in the world. And so when I first got involved in building Ruler back about 25 years ago, I worked with my uncle who was a middle school teacher, and we built this middle school program. And my uncle was the Robin Williams character in Dead Poet Society, so everything he did worked. But when we translated everything he tried to do in social emotional learning with the science that I was learning, as a psychologist, we failed. And we failed because what we realized quickly was that the adults who were teaching kids they had no background in these skills. And so we went back to the drawing board and started doing work for teachers. And then we had more success. But then what we found was that principals had not had training in emotional intelligence, so they weren't supporting the teachers. And I remember vividly back 10 or 15 years ago, I was in a school and teachers said, God, we love this training, but our principal has told us we can't do anything with Ruler until after the state test in May. And the training was in August. And I was like, all right, that's not really going to work. This is a waste of all of our time. And then we realized, okay, we've got to get our principals. And then we required principals now to come to our training, because if school is going to really do this work, they've got to do it. The principal's got to be part of it. And then we got called in by New York City schools and big districts across the United States, from Seattle to Tulsa to all over, to work with them. And we realized very quickly that we really needed that district level support. And so that's why we see Ruler as a systemic approach. And I'm going to just turn it back to Scott.
So this slide takes you through our theory of change, and it really starts with our basic strategy, which, as Mark's saying, thinks about all of the adults in a school building, all the educators, all the administrators, and then broadly in the district, and starts there. And then, of course, in addition to adults learning about emotional intelligence and how these tools can be meaningful for their own experience at work in their lives, we clearly also have a very robust set of tools for classrooms and for classroom resources from pre-K through 12th grade, as well as for out-of-school time, which we know is incredibly important for kids to have that seamless experience between the school day and then OST providers that they may be with either before or after the school day. And we do we disseminate all this content in an online platform that we have, which includes monitoring and evaluation tools as part of it. So our strategy is holistic, thinking about the different audiences within the district. And as you can see from the stakeholders, that includes families as well. And we spent a lot of time over the years trying to think about ways in which a school or a district can effectively reach out to the community with some of these tools, so that when students go home into their households, that families understand some of the things that they're learning and that everybody can benefit from the work. And our goal at the end of the day is to have really two different effects. The first one being at the individual level. And it's all about trying to change the mindset of faculty and of students and staff and administrators, and for that matter, families, to understand the science behind emotions and to teach them that science and that emotional intelligence, and to deepen SEL skills. And then the other, if this all happens the right way, is that it has a broader impact on the school community itself and on the climate. And so we aim to help schools improve the overall climate by thinking about ways in which SEL can do that. And what happens if you do this work well, and if you do it systemically, and you think about all the different steps along the way, is ideally increased engagement and performance, both in terms of your faculty and staff, as well as students. Thinking about improving the quality of relationships across the school community, which leads to less bullying in many studies that have been done on SEL through the years. It focuses on responsible decision-making and behavior. And again, it's decision-making at the board level, and it's decision-making in the third grade classroom. That's the magic of this work. If it's done well, it really can apply to all settings. The same basic principles can apply. And then certainly as it relates to the current environment in which we find ourselves, well-being and stress management, which is an important component as well for many school communities.
So before we jump in, why don't we just pause for a minute for questions? I see one in the chat box, which is, if a school has a responsive classroom, would it be confusing? So the answer is no. We're friends with Responsive Classroom, and many, many schools that have adopted Ruler do use Responsive Classroom. Remember, the focus of Ruler is really on embedding the skills and principles of emotional intelligence into the way leaders lead, teachers teach, students learn, and families parent. So, for example, in the morning meetings, that's part of Responsive Classroom, people would use tools, for example, that we have in Ruler to check in with students' feelings, to make sure that they're building that vocabulary, to ensure that children are using, evidence-based strategies to help them manage their feelings. So, no, they work fine together, and with other approaches too. So many of our districts have adopted programs like Second Step, Paths, and we've figured out very creative ways to work together. Other questions?
We do have another question, Mark. What advice do you give schools for addressing increasing levels of online bullying during the online learning phase?
It's funny, when Scott mentioned the virtual school climate, in his piece, he didn't share that we wrote a piece about this, right? That we published in EdSurge around how to think about virtual school climate. And I think the same thing applies to bullying, that for many years, I worked as a consultant, for example, with Facebook, and I'm on Twitter's bullying and safety board. And the truth is, it's a human being who is writing the nasty comments or saying the mean and hurtful things to online. And so I think the same principles apply, that we have to teach people, children and adults, right, how to manage the impulse of saying that mean or hurtful thing. And that all comes from building self-awareness, being socially aware, as well as understanding the impact of what you're saying on people, so that perspective taking and empathy, and the self-regulation, the skills to refrain from doing that and choosing a better path. So that is a big part of our training and work in Ruler at all grade levels. Any other questions for Scott or me? And Scott, you should also mention, I think you mentioned that you're the president of your school board. So, things, from that perspective also, if you have questions about that.
That's right. I sit on a school board in New York State and also in a regional school board association. So I definitely can relate to many of the challenges that we face now with our districts, whether that be everything from all the things that we talked about, from financial to e-learning to all kinds of issues that we're trying to grapple with.
Any other questions before we move forward? Okay, well, we'll be able to take them at the end as well.
So we wanted to spend some time talking about our institute, the Institute for Leaders that we hold this summer. And just to give you the overall context, this Leadership Institute for District Leadership is really the first step on an overall path, because after that, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, we also do school-based training for principals and or assistant principals and teachers, if a school wants to implement Ruler. But we really think, from what we've seen across the country and districts that have embraced Ruler and thought about it more systemically, that the best place to start is at that district level, and to create a steering committee and create a thought process about how to roll out Ruler across a district, and how to think about emotional intelligence across the district. And oftentimes that may be a rollout that takes quite a lot of time. It doesn't necessarily mean that every school right away may adopt Ruler and use the Ruler approach. We've seen districts think about the evolution of this in many different ways, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But the principle is that originally we would do the work up at the district level with you as our partners over the summer. And then there are opportunities for school-based training, and that's really where the work is brought to teachers and staff. And when a school adopts Ruler, it's important to note that for the first year, we recommend that all of the work gets done with the adults in the building, and that they learn the skills of emotional intelligence and practice the skills of emotional intelligence before the point at which it's brought into the classroom. And then after that first year, and after there's a familiarity and a comfort level with it, at that point, bring the curricular resources into the classroom and to families in the broad community, and then holistically have it be adopted in the school. And again, we can talk more about that. Obviously, every school is going to do what's right for them, and we totally respect that, but that's our recommended approach with how to think about the rollout of Ruler. So one of the things that we like to talk to schools about at the outset, before they get deep into this work, is to think about some serious questions before you embark on the work. Because we know that there are a lot of initiatives out there, and that one of the biggest issues that teachers complain about, and for that matter, that administrators complain about oftentimes, is initiative fatigue. There's initiative after initiative thrown at schools with the hope that it'll be the magical solution, and then the initiative starts, and then it loses steam, and then the next one comes into play. And we do everything we can at our center to not fall into that bucket. We want to do something that's everlasting, that's systemic, and that will really stand the test of time. And we think that one of the reasons why this work can withstand the test of time is to ask these questions up front. So the first question is, why are you doing the work? And think about the purpose of what you're trying to accomplish with the work, because it could mean different things for different schools. There may be a school that has a particular issue with teacher attrition, and they just can't keep teachers at the rate that they want to keep teachers employed in that district. And so they may want to do the work with the primary goal, it'll have other goals too, of teacher attrition. And then there may be a school that has an issue with stress and anxiety, especially in the upper grades as you have the race to college. And so maybe that's really the issue that they want to focus on. The who. So who will be charged with leading this effort at the district level, as well as ultimately when it goes to the buildings at the building level, and we can help through that thought process. The how, which is just to try to think about mapping out a very careful approach that's thoughtful in advance to figure out how to do this rollout, and we can share all the knowledge that we have as we've watched a couple thousand schools use Ruler over the course of time. And then trying to think about measurement over the course of time at a local level that makes sense for you and for your team and for your school and your district and your climate. But we certainly have ideas around measurement that we can share. And it relates back to that first question, why are you doing it? More specifically, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just some types of data that we've seen schools use as they adopt SEL and they think about Ruler. You can certainly use various means of trying to measure student engagement. That could be absenteeism, that could be dropout rates, that could be survey work. There's a wide variety of things that you could do there. Teacher engagement, you can measure anything from teacher attrition to attendance, or look at the amount of collaboration that's happening in your schools, and or even innovation if a school's trying to become more innovative. Academics is an obvious one, whether that's through standardized tests or through grades that are given locally at the school. We see all kinds of disciplinary measures that are used, whether that's suspensions or incidents that happen, whether that's bullying incidents, cyberbullying, or other. And then certainly also we've seen measures around stress and anxiety, and that could be in the adult population and or in the student population. So these are just to generate some idea flow, and they're not exhaustive, but we are always happy to have a conversation like this because it's important to us that you have the tools you need to do good work and then to be able to think about the work over time.
Thanks, Scott. There was a few questions that I thought I answered, but I realized that my questions were, or my responses were not going to anybody. So the first one in the chat box had to do with how we measure emotional intelligence. Let me just jump to that really quickly. That's been a big project for our center since actually the beginning of my career, um, because we see emotional intelligence as a real skill set, not as a belief system. What I mean by that specifically is that, for example, if I were to say, hey, Scott, how skilled are you at reading people? Now, I know Scott pretty well, but even still, how much feedback has Scott gotten across his life about his emotion perception skills? How much have I gotten? So what we find in our research is that the correlation between people's self-rated emotional intelligence and their skills is next to zero, which is pretty interesting. What that means is that we've had to work hard to develop performance tools, and our team, in collaboration with professors at the Wharton School, have spent the last 5 years really thinking through this. And so we have built tools, for example, using video-based assessments to unpack people's ability to accurately identify emotions, label emotions with precise words, and manage emotions effectively. So put simply, we use performance-based assessments as opposed to self-ratings. If I were to ask you how you're feeling, fine, I need you to share with me the feeling, and I'm going to ask you to report the feeling. But when I'm asking you about your actual skill, I need to measure it with a performance-based tool. The second question had to do with monitoring and evaluation. So within our platform with Ruler, every school gets a subscription to the platform, meaning that as teachers complete the different modules on emotional intelligence and the classroom level materials, it's being tracked, anonymously, but also it's an aggregate form for schools. We also provide you with survey tools to assess the implementation. And we as a center have a performance management metric system to help guide schools and guide our center in terms of how to provide better supports. And then, yeah, let me just stop there. And I just want to reiterate what Scott mentioned, is that we don't want to be making assumptions about why people come to Ruler for training. We want to be responsive to every school's needs. So different districts are coming for reasons around school climate, or they're coming to us for reasons of stress and burnout, or for reasons of engagement. And our goal is to really help you use the assessment tools that are going to have the most meaning, for your needs. Any other questions about that before we just kind of share with you the process of getting involved? Okay. So for the seedlings, or it used to be called seedlings because we are very grateful that a foundation in Connecticut has been subsidizing the cost of this particular Leadership Institute. We recommend bringing 3 minimum or 5 maximum participants. Superintendent is required, or at least if it's a big school district, a regional superintendent. And the teams that we recommend come are superintendents, directors, and other district level administrators. This year's Institute will begin on July 8th. It will be done virtually for reasons that we all know. And there'll be half-day virtual meetings. And as Scott was mentioning, our model is we want to make sure that the district understands systemic social emotional learning before schools start adopting the process. And so if and when you decide that you want your schools to get the real training, those are separate trainings that we offer virtually as well for principals and what we call the implementation team. This is specifically helping district level administrators think systemically about doing this work. And so, as I mentioned, it's a series of virtual meetings, and essentially the focus in the beginning is on leveraging the skills and tools of emotional intelligence. We move into managing high stakes decisions with these skills, practicing self-care and resilience. We know very clearly our center was highly responsive to when everyone was living in quarantine and schools and universities were closing, and we saw the anxiety. we wanted to make sure that we provided really good tools to schools on how to manage that. So we're constantly evolving as a center and being responsive to needs. And we think pretty clearly in the fall, practicing self-care and nurturing resilience is going to be very important for our schools. And obviously becoming stewards for change in school communities. As we've seen in our research, there's the two big issues with implementation tend to be buy-in, meaning that not every educator believes that emotions matter and wants to spend time teaching these skills or developing them for themselves. And the second is time. So that's why we feel so strongly about working with superintendents and district level leaders, because if you show that that you value this and you're working on your skills and making that public, it makes all the difference in terms of leaders buy-in and then eventually teachers and students. And then the other piece is, really supporting our district level leaders in terms of rebuilding their communities. So the way this works, as I mentioned previously, we have a generous gift from a foundation that subsidizes pretty much 70% of the cost of this. The fees that we charge at the center are $1,500 for a team of 3. And that includes all of the training and all of the content and all of our support, at the center, with you or for you. And the goal of our retreat is to just provide leaders, right, the opportunity to revitalize their professional commitment in the supportive community. We introduce, as I said, the skills of emotional intelligence and really take people through the theory of change that Scott shared with you, to dive deeply into your mindsets around emotion and understand what does it mean to have a growth mindset around emotion management. I don't know about you, but it's, I have failed a lot in my regulation over the last couple of months and keep on trying to wake up and say, all right, Mark, you can do it better today. Versus it's hopeless, I'm an anxious mess, it's over. And so we want to really help teach those skills and those mindsets so that that can be passed on to our school leaders and teachers and students. We are very fortunate at the center. We have about 2,500 schools that we have worked with across the nation in major districts. So you become part of a big community. We have a project in Connecticut that we're very excited about called Making Connecticut the First Emotionally Intelligent State. So we've trained dozens of districts here in Connecticut. And obviously we want to help you prepare for systemic implementation. So I want to stop here, and we saved enough time to take questions about the Institute. Those are the dates at the left. And you can copy that website down if you want to sign up for the Institute or learn more about it. We'll also follow up after the webinar with these PowerPoint slides for you and a recording, as well as registration information.
And just while the questions roll in, just a couple of other points, one of which is that we do envision that the format of the Institute would be synchronous and there would be interactivity. This isn't a pre-recorded Institute where then you just watch it on the screen, but rather have a chance to interact with us live and ask questions, and you'll bring many of our colleagues at the center to bear on just having this interactive experience. And that's why we've broken it up into a bunch of days, because nobody wants to sit in front of the screen for potentially 8 or 9 hours straight, like we might do in person at Yale. The other thing is that Mark had mentioned early on some of the research that we had recently done with principals and the level of anxiety that principals are feeling, understandably similar to the page that he shared at the beginning of the presentation. And so much of what the principals cited in that study of what they were looking for was really strong leadership, and that comes back to district level, whether it's the administration and or the board, and ways in which we can think about leading through this very, very difficult time in a compassionate and strong and effective way will be critical, I think, for us to make it through this period. So we hope to bring that to bear this summer, thus the title in essence for the Institute this year.
So one question is, are district leaders who have schools who have already immersed in Ruler invited? And the answer is yes. Oftentimes, in larger districts, schools have applied to come to Ruler on their own. because they have the funding or they have the interest, and the district is not yet ready. So certainly, we want to support district level leaders in systemic implementation. Other questions? Oh, I see in the,
Yep, so we did have someone ask about school level trainings, Mark, and what I'll do is I will put the link to our list of school level trainings, ruler trainings, in the chat box.
Thank you, Erin. And just so everybody has a sense of timing, we do school level trainings throughout the year, and the next set of school level trainings will be in July, and then they'll happen again in October, and then they'll continue through the winter. We historically had done them both virtually and in person, either at Yale or sometimes in regions around the country where there might be 25 or 30 schools that want to get trained at once, and therefore, you know, it makes sense for us to travel rather than all the travel expense of coming to Yale. Now with COVID-19, and certainly as Yale thinks about the future, in the immediate future, we are going to be 100% virtual. We have not made a final decision on October, but I would say it is starting to look less likely that there would be live training in October, although no final decision's been made. But we certainly will do virtual, and the virtual trainings, even before COVID, have gotten, you know, very strong reviews. And if you go to the website, you can learn more about it, or obviously reach out to us to understand the format of them, because we do note that there are a wide variety of online learning tools out there, and we try to do everything we can to make the experience really, really good.
any other questions for us? I'll just say, you know, in our closing that we learned the hard way through a lot of failure in implementing Ruler, you know, that it really, to get the outcomes that we care about for children and adults, that taking a systemic approach, you know, really makes a difference. It gives a common language across stakeholders, from a superintendent walking into a preschool or kindergarten classroom, that you have the same language to talk about emotions and the same ideas for what we call taking a meta moment, for being your best self, or strategizing. So we hope you join us, and very excited to go deeper with many of you. And we have, I think, about 15 spots left in the Institute. So if you're interested, please sign up. It starts, I believe, as I said, July 8th. And thank you for showing up, especially during these, you know, extraordinarily difficult times. And we hope that we can support you moving forward.
Appreciate being with you today.
Thank you, everybody. And please don't hesitate to reach out.